We are in the midst of a practical discussion of the relationship between soul and nature, in which Sri Aurobindo describes how that relationship can change and what are the different statuses of relationship. We saw already that our individual soul feels itself somehow free, and yet nature predominates and even tends to overwhelm and define us. But this is only the lower relationship. There is a higher relationship in spirit. When the soul moves out of this formation of mind, life and body and ascends to pure spirit, it finds it is free and nature is its power and its energy which expresses it rather than dominates or forms it. This movement of ascent from the lower relationship to the higher, Sri Aurobindo describes not only at an individual level, where we experience what happens to our own mind, our own life energies and body as we ascend in consciousness. But also the same movement extends beyond our limited personal nature into our immediate environment. And accordingly, as our consciousness becomes wider and more universal, it also extends itself into a cosmic relationship with cosmic nature. So this transition is to be explored first at an individual personal level, perhaps in some limited way between we as a conscious observer and some part of our nature, perhaps the mind, perhaps the emotions, perhaps some part or functions of the body, and then increasingly to extend this into the whole of our nature. And it would lead to a practical status of self-mastery. And then as the consciousness further widens and universalizes, it will also extend to a mastery of your immediate circumstances and eventually to all circumstances as a conscious center of the divine working in the universe. Now this graded extension from a narrow, limited personal mastery to an entire universal mastery is taking place simultaneously as our consciousness ascends the levels and at each step reorients, re-establishes its relationship with nature. Sri Aurobindo describes the different relationships drawing from the text of the Bhagavad Gita, first as witness, then upholder, source of the sanction, knower, Lord, and enjoyer. And these 6 relationships again can be experienced at each of these limited extents, perhaps starting with our relationship with our mind, our thoughts, maybe extending to our emotions, extending to our body. And each of these 6 may be developed at different levels, so to say, in different parts of our personal nature and eventually extending to wider spaces. But these 6 also can be experienced on different levels of consciousness as we ascend. Although, as we saw last time, there is a natural development in the unfolding of the 6 as we rise in consciousness. Now, I'm deliberately describing this as a multifaceted development, because in practice it is so. For example, in relation to our body and the body instincts, we may still hold a poise, much more of witness, not really experiencing the sense of upholder or source of sanction or lordship. Meanwhile, in our emotions, we may find not only we were witness, but we are upholding and we can actually modify the sanction. And meanwhile, in the thoughts, we may even acquire status of knowership and even partly of lordship, where we can wield the thoughts. So on each of these levels, we may have a different level of development. On each of them, there may be a different degree of expansion beyond the narrow personality. For example, a person who is in a space of collective work with an authority, in the position of, let's say, leader, or as a group leader, or as the person who decides what happens, directs the project. In such a position, he may already be exercising the aspect of lordship, but partially, and only in certain aspects of thought or emotion, or just the energy which he wields. And you will see this, for example, when the authority walks into the room, the whole team, which was pretty much diverse and distracted and spread out, fragmented, suddenly senses the boss is coming, and they tighten up, they get focused, and they get realigned. May not be conscious at all, but just the fact that this person is in a relationship of authority, and people have accepted that relationship, and the energy he brings into the group is one of clarity and holding, directing. Without saying a word, by the mere presence, there is an exercise of the relationship of lordship in the environment in a very limited space. And so there's a double movement. You grow to awaken and free yourself from this narrow, limited starting point. At the same time, you assist your own nature to grow and become free, to reflect and express the divine nature. And there's a double movement of awakening. And that's the nature of this yoga. The ascetic yogas discard nature completely. And so they do not assist nature's awakening. As far as nature is concerned, she says, oh, this fellow has escaped and abandoned me. Whereas the affirmative, life-embracing and life-transforming nature of the integral yoga says, this too must be raised along with the awakening of the consciousness. And there's a double support in the movement. And in this, you have now come to the poise of the sanctioner and growing more and more into the knowledge lordship by selecting habitually, rejecting what is offered, determining. The relatively passive has become an entirely active sanction, is on the way and is on the way to be an active control. So we're awakening, we discover we can change. I can make my mind conscious. I can direct broadly my thoughts. With that choice, you may have played with for a while, but after a while you lost interest. And so automatically, although your life is wandering, although it is going zigzag, the trend of the zigzag is in the direction of the spirit. So one can say, whether in this life or the next, you will realize the self. Why? Because the self chose this as the direction. But will it be this life or the next or the one after? That depends on how much time you spend in the zigzag or how rapidly you move towards that goal. And there may be a whole complexity of other issues involved. But those also ultimately are broadly set by the choice of the self. The self may say, I would like to have a broad and more complex experience and realization, so it needs to go through more rich and diverse experiences. Or the self may choose, I want to get there quickly, not too much time to lose, and I'm willing to compromise the diversity and complexity that can be worked on later. And the turn is less zigzag, more rapid. If you take an example of a person like Ramana Maharshi, who came with that mission as a vibhuti, the purpose was set at the very origin before even the movement to birth came. And it came with the force and the power to fulfill that. And you see the tendency in childhood. In childhood, he would go into such deep sleep that you couldn't wake him up. So when his friends found out that he was in such sleep, they tried to wake him through water, hit him, and he wouldn't wake up. So they said, oh, here's an interesting thing. And they were kids, they were trying to do mischief. The mischief bug caught them, whatever we may say. So they would drag him out of his bed, beat him up thoroughly and throw him back in the bed, and he would get out of bed with bruises, not knowing what happened. Now nobody goes into that depth of sleep unless the inner being was already so familiar, or it drew the personality in to such a depth. It's almost as if he came with that, but at a deep level. The surface personality knows nothing about it. But that is tilting the balance. And naturally one day he walks out of the house and says, this is what I wish to do. He goes into the hills, sits down. Nobody to teach him. But he begins the meditation and begins to go deep. Why? Led by the magnetic pull of the self. He goes into this underground room, chamber of the temple, so that he is not disturbed. Rats start biting at his feet when he is in deep meditation. He comes out of the meditation, there are wounds on his feet, bleeding. He's not eating, he's not feeling hungry. Doesn't matter somehow. And of course, as he describes it, he attained to the realization of the self in 3 days. But then, it's not a state he is able to live in all the time. So it took him 10 years to stabilize that experience until he lived in it constantly. And then, what was his purpose in life? To hold that realization and impact the world from that. That was his mission. What do? You don't need to do anything. And so there were circumstances, nature, his mother came, devotees formed, they would bring him food. His mother shifted him to a cave which was more comfortable, less harmful to his body, bit by bit, and he accepted each of these. He could have said no. But since that was the mission, there was a sanction, okay. But there was not an active involvement to draw these things. If at all you may say the self chose, and so those things were drawn to him and circumstances formed around it. But the mission was very specific and it was accomplished in a very relatively short time. He stayed as long as it was necessary. When it was time to leave, that's it. But what did he do when he left? There's a beautiful example which comes from that. When he's about to leave his body, one of the disciples asks him, please don't leave us. And he says, where can the self go? Living in the self. Your body is there, you shed the body, you take it on, you shed it. You are right there, the self is right there. Makes no difference. So where is he? Still there. What is he doing? Still what he was doing. That's it. The set outcome was already there in the first vision of the self as it looked forward. This is what I want to accomplish. Whether across 100 lives, whether across a single life, simple, rapid, not rich and diverse in its scope. But this was the mission, this was done, over. Fate. Free choice of the self, towards which nature must inexorably move because nature is its power. Even if it takes the poise of witness, it is indirectly providing a sanction and a choice. It is indirectly providing this selection and leading things eventually to that outcome. So the point Sri Aurobindo makes is, when the soul accepts its complete function, accepts to be the knower, and it releases the choice, well, there is in that the knowledge of the force that acts and determines. It sees the value of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. The moment a shift is made, there's a ripple everywhere because everything is interconnected. The moment you make this choice within you, I've decided this, immediately there's a ripple going out. But if you're conscious of this and you're conscious of the fact that you make this choice, you're conscious of what it is that's rippling out. The values of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. Now everything starts reorienting based on those ripples. It is in the secret fate. And all this happens when the soul accepts its complete function as the knower, lord and enjoyer of nature. But first step as knower. It is in the secret of fate. But the force is itself determined by the knowledge, which is its origin and the source, and standardizer of its valuations and effectuations of values. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the action. So now the relationship between the knowledge and the action is being explored. The force you're conscious of, oh, it's happening. I chose this and there's a ripple. But Sri Aurobindo goes back to what is directing the force. The force is determined by the knowledge which is its origin and the source. So I may have set, let's say, a broad intention. I want to dedicate my life to, let's say, service to humanity. It may be a choice that the soul makes before birth, or sometimes it wakes up to that choice as the personality has awakened and says, this is what I wish to do. And then the chain of events follows. But you realize the chain of events, the force itself as it works out, what was its origin? In the knowledge. It is that knowledge which is secretly prodding and directing the force. Every time an energy moves, it is because that knowledge inside the energy says, this is where I want to go. And it moves that way. Circumstances change, this is what I want. And it moves that way. So the navigation of the energy is by the inherent knowledge in the force. So the force is itself determined by the knowledge which is its origin and the source and standardizer of its valuations and effectuations of values. And this is the part which is extremely important to recognize. As the force moves, what determines the values that the source holds? What is the standard of its reference? The knowledge inside says, every time circumstances change, the things which allow me to serve best, that is the value I pursue. In somebody else, the turn of the spirit may be heroism and courage and self-sacrifice for a cause. And every time that arrangements move, this is the standard of reference that determines the movement of the energies in my thoughts, in my feelings, even in my body. In somebody else, the turn of the self may be to worship the divine in beauty. And as a child, as I grow, in every movement of my unfolding personality, the sense of beauty, the sense of harmony, the sense of the sacred, these are the things which are held as the standard of reference. So you read the words again very carefully. The force is itself determined by the knowledge which is its origin and the source and standardizer of its valuations. How do I value this situation? How do I value this friendship? How do I value this job offer? How do I value these different attractions? By the content of that knowledge, this love of beauty, art, the worship of the sacred. But the force is itself determined by the knowledge which is its origin and the source and standardizer of its evaluations and effectuations of values. So the play of force is determined by the knowledge. The knowledge originates the force and is the source of the standardizer of its values. It is also the source of the effectuation of its values. Knowledge is the starting point. Knowledge in awareness, I am. Not what I do, what I am. And that ripples out and changes nature. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions. It's amazing. It's very pithily, very concisely described. But what it captures is the full relationship of the state of consciousness, knowledge of the soul, rising into knowledge, and how it affects everything. And this is the Jnata Ishvara, the knower lordship. How long will it take? None of that is included in this. It's the direction and effectivity of the force. The circumstances of life may change, the direction and effectivity of the force is set by the status of knowledge. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions. Now, it's not at any point, it may still effectuate certain actions, but that's not what is making for the result. What it's doing from the knowledge state of consciousness is actually determining the result, irrespective of the actions made. This is why it is fate. What it is inevitable, and therefore he has said also, it is in the secret of fate. Contrast this with a normal person. I do this, I try this, I push, I pull, my knowledge is leading, but what knowledge? Surface, mind, likes, dislikes, books read, advice received, or my own some intuition or insight, I chase, pull, push. Maybe something happens. More often, something happens which I did not intend, and I realize, wow, this was so much better than what I could have intended. That's the lower working of the soul in the superficial knowledge, nature, bound, etc. What we're speaking of here is something totally different. It is this poise of knowledge of the soul which determines the outcome without concern with the intermediate processes. They're all led by this. Now imagine, as you grow into this state, it has this effect in you, in your personality, in your nature, in your environment, the people with which you interact, and the space you're responsible for. But also as your consciousness widens, it has an impact further beyond. And it is this which is the true sense of lordship and the basis for the siddhi of Aishwarya. Ishvara, Lord. Aishwarya is the nature of being Lord. What we are discussing here is something fundamentally different. It comes from a poise of consciousness, which from the status of this true knowledge influences the outcome from a poise of freedom and remains ever free even as it acts. It's never bound even to its action or to the consequence of its action. And so with it comes the second facet. Nor can it do this without becoming the active enjoyer, bhakta. And then he explains the nature of the lower enjoyment and the higher enjoyment. But the character of the higher enjoyment is whatever it engages with, it is enjoying, but from a poise of freedom, which is detached and yet equal and free. In contrast, the normal action we have of enjoyment is bound in the duality. This is pleasurable, this is painful, and you cannot escape from this. But from that poise, you have the equal enjoyment and the true character of the delight. So maybe just quickly to read this, but we'll explore it in detail next time. In the lower being, the enjoyment is of a twofold kind, positive and negative, which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. But in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight in self-manifestation. The nature of the delight is, I am manifesting myself. The movement of delight is the manifestation of self. Not doing something, but fulfilling yourself. There is no loss of freedom, no descent into an ignorant attachment. The man free in his soul is aware that the divine is the Lord of the action of nature, that Maya is his knowledge will determining and effecting all, that force is the will side of this double divine power, in which knowledge is always present and effectual. And he is also aware of himself as a part and portion of the divine as a center of action in the world, which he discusses later. So all this we will take up next Friday. In our study of the synthesis of yoga, we are in the chapter titled The Soul and Nature, and the backdrop to this discussion is Sri Aurobindo showing us the underlying unity and oneness of all reality, which must eventually be realized in the tiniest detail of every experience of life. And having placed that as the first foundation, he takes up step by step the various aspects of reality and brings them into alignment with that underlying unity to show how it is that same oneness which moves to differentiate itself as these very distinct and sometimes opposing facets of reality. Soul and nature are two such. When you distinguish one from the other, you see nothing in common, nothing that links. Anything that moves, anything that changes is nature. Anything that is unchanging, permanent, and perhaps essentially even timeless, free of all conditioning, is soul. How can these two ever meet? In their very definition, they are opposite to each other. In our subjective experience, we feel, we sense, we experience that we have a nature which is part of a larger nature, and that nature is as if pushing into us, trying to form us, determine even our thoughts, emotions, behavior patterns. And yet, subjectively we feel we are none of these things. We feel that we are free or should be capable of being free, and with that we feel a responsibility to assert that freedom. Not only that, we feel that we should be able to determine these patterns of nature and improve them, remove what is wrong, bring something which is better. And the sense of an individuality there, the sense of the soul, distinctly feels itself not nature. And so there is this collision of interests and objectives, and in spite of all the compulsive power that nature has on us, because it's the whole universe which is infinite versus I which is tiny and finite, in spite of that, not only I am able to be conscious, disengage myself to become reasonably free, but I am able to push back and even change my nature and my immediate surrounding nature, and eventually I hope to change all nature. These two, being fundamentally opposite to each other, how can they be really held in one underlying unified consciousness? Is that even possible? If it is so, we need to be able to recognize how from that oneness these two derive, and whether in that we can find the secret of their true relationship. In the discussion so far, Sri Aurobindo already showed us that this relationship of soul and nature exists on two very different levels. There is a lower relationship where nature seems to determine, control, and even is the source of our individuality and the sense of being a soul. But there is a higher relationship, not in the mind, which is formed by nature, not in the life energies or matter, which are also formed by nature, but in a spiritual state of consciousness, which is not formed by nature. And when our soul ascends to that state of a spiritual consciousness, I am spirit, at that point the relationship is reversed. Nature is found to be my power of expression. I am free, essentially Lord of this whole play of energies. Between this lower relationship of being completely subject to nature and the higher relationship of being free and Lord of nature, what's the transition? How can we ascend from this state to that? And Sri Aurobindo explains, with each step of the ascension of consciousness, our relationship with nature changes also, fundamentally. If you move up one step, you have a new relationship. Nature relates to you differently. Move up another step and you have a new relationship. Using the vocabulary of the Bhagavad Gita, Sri Aurobindo describes these as 6 stages or 6 relationships that we have. The Purusha is, says the Gita, that is, the soul is witness, upholder, source of sanction, knower, Lord, enjoyer. Prakriti, that is nature, is the executive power, and as an active power, she has an operation that corresponds to the attitude of Purusha. And this is what he is mapping now. In other words, as we will see, the Purusha status being 6-fold or in 6 degrees, at each of these degrees the Purusha can choose to relate to nature differently, and nature's activity then changes according to that relation. Now, why is this important? Because this is the means by which we as individuals, with what feels to be a very finite and limited power of consciousness, can actually ascend these stages and recast our relationship with nature at each step. First, recasting our relationship with our own nature. That means our own thoughts, our own emotions, even our physical instincts, and the relationship of I being bound to my instincts, bound to my emotional reactions, bound to my habits of thought, can shift now to a status through these 6 steps until I can say, I decide how my mind thinks. I choose the play of my emotions. I reprogram my body and its instincts to be what I will freely. This is the kind of freedom that we wish to experience. The problem in this whole discussion is the moment I begin to choose my thoughts, I shape my thoughts, I think differently. What happens? I get sucked into the thought process itself. I get sucked into the emotions which I am now trying to change. I become identified with the body in which I am trying to modify my instincts and reactions. I have lost my position of soul, who is free. I become engaged, and the moment I am engaged and struggling with my thought and emotions, they bind me. You've ever tried to do that when you have a sticky thought or a sticky emotion that bothers you, especially if it catches you in the middle of the night? You wake up with something that's bothering you, and the more you grapple with it, the more it pulls you into it, and there is no way out. Perhaps the only way was not to mess around with it and step away from it and walk away. Then perhaps you will be reasonably free and it will go on doing exactly what it wants. But you can never master it by getting into it. And so the key Sri Aurobindo shows us is through this 6-fold ascension, the soul remains soul. It never enters nature. But by changing its relationship with nature, nature changes also to reflect its new relationship. Until at its height, the soul takes on the poise of lordship and freedom and enjoyer, where nature flows to now fulfill the soul's choice or will freely, while the soul still remains free, not embedded, not entering it to struggle with it. Simply by changing the relationship of how it perceives nature, it shifts the very response of nature. And so this text is extremely valuable. It shows us the key to our practical freedom in poise of consciousness. This position of active control and even of possessor and director of the knowledge and the will. This it becomes when the soul accepts its complete function as the knower, Lord, and enjoyer of nature. So this is going to be the next three steps: knower, Lord, and enjoyer. Now we had seen this text already last time, so I'm going to only summarize, but it's important to review it now from the big picture, because then we will see what the culmination of this whole sequence leads to. As the knower, the soul possesses the knowledge of the force that acts and determines. It sees the values of being which are realizing themselves in cosmos. It is in the secret of fate. And we saw how profound this line is last time. Free choice of the self. What the self sees itself to be, knows itself to be, unfolds inevitably in the movement of nature as the fate, inevitable in space and time. So it, from this poise now, from knowledge, it is in the secret of fate. It's not yet master of fate, but in the knowledge it has the secret of fate. But from knowledge will be, remember, Lord and enjoyer. That's when the mastery will come. But the force is itself determined by the knowledge, which is its origin and the source and the standardizer of its valuations and effectuations of values. We saw this last time, but the very fact that you have the knowledge, it is the originator of the force. We have seen the earlier examples. It leads to that. But he has used two phrases: standardizer of its valuations. What the values are become the norm, become the standards. And it is the effectuation also, the source of effectuation of the values, makes them, compels them to take effect. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions. The more you are conscious of the values and the working of the force, the more you are controlling. But again, without getting into nature. Suggestion. He throws in the word once again, as the soul becomes. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower. Why again? When was it the knower? Oh, it was long, long, long ago, before it entered into this movement of experience. It was always the knower in its origin. And then it entered into this experience of the individual focus and experience of life, and somewhere along the way lost that knowledge, lost the poise of knower and the poise of Lord and enjoyer, which was present in its origin. So in the sequence of events, in the cosmic manifestation, there is the soul looking at the whole possibilities and releases from it the power to fulfill those possibilities, and it says, I want to enjoy it from inside the game, and it puts forward a part of itself into the game. And at that point in the entry into the game, it loses the poise of lordship and knower, and becomes now as if a tool and puppet of nature. She is nourishing me, she is making me. I am born with my body, and when my body dies, I will cease to exist. Or so it feels. And so you have lost the true knowledge, increasingly as you recover it. Therefore, in proportion as the soul becomes again the knower, it becomes also the controller of the actions of nature. And so with the knower, increasingly the action of the force is in your control. You have grown to become controller, and you are now active enjoyer. The Sanskrit word bhokta from the Bhagavad Gita. What kind of enjoyment is it? Recall last time we discussed how each of these 6 stages can be experienced on all levels. But they become more perfect as the levels rise. So you can even be enjoying things at a lower level. I am partially witness, partially able to disengage. And even in that partial disengage, I have some control and I am enjoying. But I'm still a product of nature. I'm largely embedded in nature with some partial enjoyment. So there is enjoyment at this level. And then as I grow into increasing freedom in a higher grade of consciousness where the freedom is effortless, and from there the control grows, enjoyment grows, the grade of enjoyment is completely different. What's the difference between this and that? And this is what he gives you now. The text he gives is extremely profound, extremely suggestive, and we'll try to explore some of the implications. In the lower being, the enjoyment is of a twofold kind, positive and negative, which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. But in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight in self-manifestation. If we just take this one sentence with these two parts and go into the details of it, you will find extraordinary implications, many important ideas which are implied behind this. So first, in the lower being, the enjoyment is of a twofold kind, but in the higher being, it is not twofold, it is single, equal. Why is it twofold here? In the lower being, the consciousness is divided, and therefore any experience gets fragmented, even in its perception, even in the experience itself. Whereas in the higher being, which is in the consciousness of the spirit, there is only spirit. There is no divided consciousness. Spirit is always one, indivisible, complete. And so there the experience is also delight of what? Its own manifestation. Because there is nothing else. But in here in the lower being, because there is I and there is the not I and the bulk of it is not I, there is always the fragmentation. So enjoyment is fragmented into two kinds, positive and negative. Which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. So now there are two different things. There is the enjoyment itself which is positive and negative, and then in the sensation and the electricity that flows in the sensation, it takes this form of joy and suffering. But at its essential level, it has nothing to do with joy or suffering. It is still enjoyment that is positive or negative. And so let's see how that works. You have, let's say, something which happens to you which would make you happy, and you say, oh, this is so good, I am so happy. It's positive enjoyment. And something happens now which causes you distress, and you are now upset or you're depressed. What do? I am so unhappy. I am so depressed. I am so. And where does this go? I call up everybody. I meet people. I say, you know how unhappy I am. You know how depressed I feel. And someone says, snap out of it. Things will change. You don't understand. I am so miserable. And you see what's happening somewhere inside. You're affirming a kind of an enjoyment and a wallowing in that distress. But it's a negative enjoyment. But it's still enjoyment. The energy you're putting into this wallowing in the experience is exactly the same as in the positive experience. You are enjoying, but positively or negatively. But when that positive or negative experience enters the electricity of your nerves, then you say, this is joyous and this is suffering. When are you suffering? When you translate it into terms of the electricity of the nervous system, evoking in your emotions or mind something. But the way the soul meets it, without this electricity of the nerves, is just a positive kind and a negative kind. And you have to dwell upon this. It's something extremely profound. If you begin to introspect, you will discover it's actually a choice that you can make. Whether you accept an event with a positive enjoyment or with a negative enjoyment. The same positive thing that somebody will see as positive, you can choose to enjoy it negatively. Oh, I'm so happy I won the lottery of 100 rupees. And the other fellow says, what? A lottery of 100 rupees? What a waste of time. I've been wasting so many hours buying all these tickets. What's the difference? So there's this classic example of someone looks at the glass and says, it is half full, I can drink water. And someone says, oh, it's half full. Something is missing in it. How you look is just that shift of the choice made. But the person who's miserable because it's half full is enjoying that condition of feeling miserable, or the experience which is behind it, which once it enters the nerves, takes on this character in the electricity of a joy or suffering. But if you step back from the joy, suffering to the deeper poise, you can shift it there and actually choose to translate any situation into joy, if you so decide. And if you don't so decide, then you chose to not so decide, and you chose to accept it as a suffering. Once you realize the implication of this, once you face the implication of this, you realize that you are responsible when you are suffering. It's not nice to accept this because it suddenly puts the entire burden of responsibility on you. But if you can face it, you come to the conclusion, I have no reason to ever be unhappy or suffer. At least to the extent that I can become conscious. To the extent I am not conscious, well, it's machinery in my body. You stick a needle, it causes pain. But in the part where I am conscious in my thoughts and emotions, I can choose to not be unhappy about the pain. I say, oh, okay, it hurts, but here I have a choice. Problems come in my life and I can say, okay, so now something wants me to grow up. What's the message? What do I need to do now? And that's the choice you make. I've mentioned before the example of somebody in the ashram. He's the head of our laboratory, now almost 90 years old. And he shared his experience with me. He said at the age of 21, one day he just woke up, one morning. He just wakes up and realizes, I can choose to be happy. Happiness is my birthright. Nothing can take away from me this choice. And he said, I decided never again in life to be ever unhappy. I'll always be happy. A choice he made. And that's it. Poof, it was done. And he says, never in his life, whatever may have happened, he never lost his poise of being happy. And it is as easy as this. The recognition and the choice made. And that's it. And so when we come to this, from knower to controller, preparing for lordship, and comes the enjoyer, you realize you can actually choose to be enjoying. And the choice of a positive enjoyment rather than a negative enjoyment. But the fact is, as long as you're in this divided grades of experience, in the divided mind, divided life energy, divided matter, there will always be this twofold kind of enjoyment, positive and negative, which in the electricity of sensation translates itself into joy and suffering. So having got into you in the electricity of sensation with this duality, you can still make a choice of which side of the duality you choose to be. But the experience here, the knowledge here is very profound. There is a choice made on a deeper level, and then there's its translation into the electricity of the nerves. If you removed the electricity of the nerves, what would the consciousness be like? How would you relate to it? And why is it in the electricity of nerves does it translate into this duality? And there's a deep suggestion here. I don't want to go too much into it, but he uses the word electricity. He could have just said in the sensations of the nerves. And he's saying this because this is the reality happening. The electricity itself is a physical translation of life energy, and the principle of delight, ananda, working in the material domain. And that's why joy or delight in physical body or in emotions always has an electric character. But the pure ananda will always have this equal enjoyment of the divine delight in the fragmented consciousness of matter and emotions, or to that extent mind, because electricity operates on all three levels. In the fragmented consciousness, this takes on this duality in electricity. So just as there is a physical electricity in the physical nerves, there is an emotional electricity in the emotional consciousness and a mental grade of electricity in the mental consciousness. That experience we would have all had at some point when in certain states you have a bright illumination of or inspiration or insight, and like a flash, like a light, but with it comes a feeling of an electric current in the mind. And it is to this he is referring, because the origin of that electric character is up there in the principle of the bliss translating on all these levels into the physical body and nerves, into matter. And so physical electricity that you measure in your science lab or in the electronics of the devices which you hold has this dual character of negative and positive because of this, because it is in matter in a divided consciousness. And at a very physical level, there is only one underlying truth, represented in two ways of looking at it. There is a flow of delight or sensation or experience in a fragmented consciousness in which you can see it therefore as positive or negative, but it's one thing which cannot be divided in its essence. Pure physics. You see, the truth of what we discovered psychologically and the electricity aspect of that truth all the way down to the physical plane. And if you can hold this, it's such a beautiful idea. It's such a beautiful vision of the truth of this, the nature of experience of delight, or its apparent division into joy and suffering, all the way down to matter. And so that's why I said this phrase is extremely profound in what it carries. Reading it casually, we would just say, oh, it's a poetic description, he's describing electric movement. No, there's much more to it. So this is the reality at a lower level. There is still the underlying truth of one indivisible experience which now gets split in appearance. And the soul experience it positively or negatively. But as we rise up in consciousness and as we enter the higher status increasingly, where the division becomes less and less prominent, and when we are finally in the oneness of spirit, in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment. Everything that comes, all experiences, is equally received with equal joy and with equal active enjoyment. It's not like I enjoy this more, I enjoy this less, or to this I am not so active, to that I am more active. Equally active to all things. Oh, wow, wow. Now, again, to take an example here in the physical experience of matter in our body. And this is an example Sri Aurobindo gives in the Life Divine. He says, if you observe the nature of pleasure and pain, which is the positive and negative side in the sensation, what distinguishes one from the other? If you gently caress the skin, that feels nice, it's pleasurable. Now the person starts pressing a little more, increase the pressure, or just continue long enough, eventually, okay, now that's getting irritating. Now it's getting painful. Enough. Why don't you stop it? The transition from pleasure to something relatively neutral to something which is now painful is a continuous scale. What determines the transition point? And Sri Aurobindo says the transition point is determined by your capacity to bear. Now when I'm sick, I'm in high fever, my body is weak, fragile, I've not eaten enough, I'm hypersensitive, the slightest touch produces for me too much. Why are you speaking so loudly? I can't stand it. My nerves are unable to contain. And when my nerves come back into strength and perhaps in an exaggerated poise of energy, dominating, I am speaking loudly, not realizing that I might be hurting somebody else. And they can shout all they want, I can dominate and push back even more. What is the change? Is your capacity to bear. So Sri Aurobindo explains, in any life form or life experience, when there is a contact of any kind, as long as the contact is something which is within its capacity to assimilate and make use of, it experiences it as pleasurable. When the contact comes and it has no use for it, it can assimilate, it need not, it cannot, it doesn't matter, it's no use, then it is neutral. So the air is on my skin, I don't feel it. Neutral contact. The air blows when my skin is perspiring, I feel cool, it feels pleasant because I'm healthy. But when I'm in fever, the same air blowing, I feel a chill, I'm shivering because it's now harming my life. I'm unable to contain, it is overwhelming and harming me. It is destroying my ability to be in balance. So you notice, you have a working of life force, a point of contact from the universe. If it can absorb to grow, it's pleasurable. If it has no value, it is neutral. If the contact is disbalancing me and harms me, then it is painful. If you look at the nature of the experience, it is exactly the same thing. All that's changed is your consciousness's ability to contain or make use of it. Or the way your consciousness uses it, if you now look at it in absolute terms. When your consciousness takes the contact to grow, it is pleasurable. When it receives the contact to not grow or lose, it is painful. That's all. Positive direction or negative direction in the electricity of the contact. That's all there is to it. But if you look at it from an even more objective position, when this thing cannot contain the contact, well, it pretty much deserves to break down, to be replaced by what the contact is now forming around it. Something new. So in my body, when the contact is too harsh, the cells which are weak are being broken down, and the very contact entering creates now a new repair process, triggers off a new process of cell repair to replace what was already weak and fragile. Nothing wrong. It's just the way nature flows. Energy flows against energy, objects against objects, and something grows, something diminishes to be replaced by something else. Nothing is changing in the big picture. And so when you look at it from that poise of consciousness, nothing was ever lost. Nothing was ever built. It is just part of one continuum of change in the whole, remaining exactly what it was. And so from that poise, it seems as if equal to all events. I'm just showing you how there's a continuity in perspective. From being inside in the ego of this object, I am overwhelmed or I am nourished. You step out to something more impersonal, less egocentric, more inclusive. As this is being eaten by the other, that is growing. This bigger one, the plant is eating up the soil. The plant is being eaten by the goat. The goat is being eaten by some tiger. And I'm seeing the chain and I see nothing good or bad. It's just life force modifying itself through forms. And so there is an equal perspective. So from the poise of a consciousness which is one, which is equally in all things, there is no question of pain or pleasure. There is equality in the variation of experience. Whether more intense or less intense, I equally enjoy sensation and the play of the sensation. And at which point we will have to use a different word because it's neither pain nor pleasure, delight. Equally. In the soft caress and in the hard scratch, delight. The glimpse of this you see in times when children are playing excitedly, they're playing football, they're running around, bumping into each other, all having great fun. They come back and now the energy diminishes. I'm feeling pain on my arm. Oh, I cut myself, it's bleeding. But I realize it now when my energy has dimmed enough that now the pain symptom emerges. But when my energy was high in the enthusiasm, that scratch was as pleasurable as a caress. To the divine consciousness which is in all things and embraces all things from within and from around, the bleeding is equally an experience of delight as the nourishing and the growth of everything. And so, but in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight. In what? What is the divine doing? Remember, we are looking at it from the perspective of the soul. What is the soul doing when nature is doing all this? Because increasingly as the soul ascends, it recognizes nature as expressing its own knowledge, its own control. Even eventually we will see its own power and energy. And so what is the soul doing? It choosing to be different things, different possibilities, like a creator, like a dreamer, like a scriptwriter or a director of a play. It chooses and nature is performing and unfolding. So what does nature experience? Manifesting itself. I wish to experience this, I wish to become this. And the moment I begin to experience the wish and the joy of it, nature begins to perform and unfold it. And the relationship increasingly now becomes, whatever I dream of, she is manifesting. Whatever I imagine now becomes true in the play of nature. And what's the joy then? Self-manifestation. So he says, in the higher, it is an actively equal enjoyment of the divine delight in self-manifestation. And now the relationship of the soul with nature has already shifted. Nature now is fulfilling all that the soul dreams itself or sees itself to be. Where earlier at the beginning, the soul felt itself constricted, bound by nature which was trying to impose itself and its habits on the soul. And now it's the reverse, the joy of self-creation, self-manifestation. Now we will see, as I said earlier, this can be experienced on all levels. Even in our limited capacity that we have in life, every time our greatest joy in life is when we manifest some possibilities within us. The joy of creating something, the joy of expressing yourself. Now it's not always seen as works of art or works of music, which you are obviously manifesting from your own experience or state of consciousness. It's happening all the time. When the person is arranging a space to make it comfortable. You come into a new house, maybe there are things around, you say, I don't like this color, we'll change this color, we'll put a little paint here, we'll cut a little window there, we'll hang a picture here. What are you doing? You are shaping your circumstances to manifest you, your consciousness, your state of being, until it matches. When it matches, you say, now it is my space, my home, isn't it? Everything you do in life is ultimately a and effort to manifest yourself. You're walking on the road, somebody falls and hurts himself. What do? You say, "Oh, poor fellow," and you walk on. Or you say, "Oh, can I help you?" What's the difference between the two? The only difference is their state of consciousness and their relationship with themselves. In one, the person is naturally, temperamentally empathic, you will say, and so immediately the effort goes to help. In the other person, the person is temperamentally more observant and detached, disinterested in relationships, and says, "Oh, the fellow is not seriously hurt, it's okay, I can go on, poor fellow." The state of consciousness determines the spontaneous response in your nature, isn't it? If you think about it deeply enough, you come to a profound conclusion. All that you do, all that happens around you, whether you do it consciously or not, is a representation of who you are. If you become yourself truly, your circumstances automatically will become a reflection and expression of what you are. So be truly, and the becoming will take place. You will do it, but you won't think, "Do I do or not do?" You flow, depending on what you are within. Your nature flows. Okay? So it's a profound insight. The problem is, am I myself truly? Not really. Right now I'm a bit confused in what I am in my awareness. And so there are kind of layers blocking who you are. Who you are truly is the soul, the divine presence, which is all good, which is all truth, sacred, beautiful. And if there were not intervening layers which distort, this is what would spontaneously express in life. But now what happens is there are layers, and the layers distort it. Because I am all good and all beautiful, when in my circumstances there is ugliness or perversion, the layer, rather than expressing the all good to change the perversion by this power of the all good, it feels itself helpless, it feels itself trapped, and it tries to push back in anger, in upset, in agitation, because it is all good. It cannot stand ugliness or distortion, but reacts because there's a layer, not allowing the pure flow out. So when you, so to say, unveil the layers which distort and let what you are reveal itself, nature flows perfectly aligned to manifest effortlessly. You don't seem to be doing anything. Your nature is doing it, it's happening. You are knower, lord and enjoyer of nature. Now at this point he's brought us to this position. There is no loss of freedom, because you are never engaged and bound in the movement. You are simply consciously choosing being. There is no loss of freedom, no descent into an ignorant attachment. The man free in his soul is aware. Now what was driving nature? Is aware that the divine is the lord of the action of nature, that Maya is his knowledge, will, determining and effecting all, that force is the will side of this double divine power, in which knowledge is also present and effectual. He is aware of himself also, even individually, as a center of the divine existence, a portion of the Lord, the Gita expresses it, controlling so far the action of nature which he views, upholds, sanctions, enjoys, knows, and by the determinative power of knowledge, controls. Now, to the extent that you are in this space, which is in your space of control and view and control, you are representing the divine or a portion of the divine in this space. Otherwise, the divine is all that is doing, is the only one that's doing everything through nature. But here, where I am a portion of the divine in this space, the divine works through me in this limited activity. But in this, all these 6 layers, 6 relationships are present. So again, this is a long sentence with many implications. The most important outcome of this is you remain free. I'll give an analogy here again to highlight the difference. Let's say the soul now is seated in the chariot, which is the body, which has horses tied to it, our life energies or senses. And then there is the charioteer, the intellect, some part of the mind, which is guiding. And you're the tourist. What does a tourist do? You say, take me to the most interesting places. I don't know what they are. That fellow knows, the horses know, the chariot has its own limitations. It cannot go into marshy space, it can only go where land is stable. And nature does its thing. But I set my relationship by saying, I want to experience the most interesting places, and all the machinery follows. As we go along, you know what? I don't like being inside dense forest. It scares me. Can you take me into open spaces? I don't know where the open space is. I don't know how to get there. They know, they do it. I'm just enjoying. But from this poise, I have never engaged myself in a way that I'm bound. What would it be to be bound? When I, sitting at the back, now get into what we call backseat driving. Turn left, turn right, slow down a little bit, go faster. Hey horse, you're not in sync with the other one. We should gallop together. And I put my hands into their legs and make them gallop. And now I am nature. I'm a creature of nature. Do I really have freedom? I'm bound in the very processes and tendencies of the horse. I'm lost. But here in this poise, I'm simply enjoying, and the whole journey shapes itself, and I wander and enjoy. As an analogy, it helps to recognize the difference. So now observe our own normal state. We are largely a product of nature. In the very moment when we think that we are thinking, there is a large part of nature still involved. I am thinking, not so clear today. What will people say? I have to perform well. This is a demanding thing. People are going to judge me from what I say or do now. And this is still part of nature. Even the part which temporarily detaches itself to improve is still valuing itself in terms of nature values. What will people say? I will lose my credibility. I will not be liked by my friends. And when you first step back sufficiently, you begin to question those values. Am I here to live by other people's standards? What is my standard? What do I really want? And that introspection begins the first step of drawing out the deeper values of the true soul. But otherwise, while we experience ourselves, oh, I can control my thought, I can control my behavior, it's still a part of nature itself, developing a kind of a partial self-control to improve herself. In a way, you are reflecting the freedom of the soul in a narrow part of your consciousness. But you do not have the true freedom until you are able to stand back completely from it all. So the first step of the journey is this poise of witness, to be completed as thoroughly as possible, from where then the process of self-mastery can begin. So you will recall the earlier portion where Sri Aurobindo again draws from the Bhagavad Gita. Increasingly as you become Swarat, free and a self-ruler over the kingdom of its own life and being, he can also exercise and increase control of the environment and the world to become Samrat, emperor of the world. But it starts with a center, and from where the whole relationship begins to grow. But what makes for this change of expansion of the relationship with larger nature? And that's the next sentence, all of which we will explore next time. He says, And when he universalizes himself, so far it was I, the individual, as a portion of the divine. When he universalizes himself, his knowledge reflects only the divine knowledge. When I was individual, it was the divine knowledge working, the divine will working as the Maya force or action in nature. As the universalization takes place, my knowledge joins with that knowledge which was guiding nature. And his will effectuates only the divine will, which was so far guiding nature. So what happens? Your knowledge and your will joining with that larger movement, naturally the scope of the impact is also now greater. He enjoys only the divine delight and not an ignorant personal satisfaction. While earlier there was this partial delight of my personal satisfaction, it grows now into that which is part of the cosmic delight. Thus the Purusha preserves its freedom in its possession. At that point you're possessing literally the world in the scope of the enjoyment, and yet free. A renunciation of limited personality even in its representative enjoyment and delight of cosmic being. So you have abandoned the narrow limited individuality, you're enjoying this larger cosmic enjoyment, but also representing it in the limited being, which you're not bound to, but which is the focus of a certain part of the enjoyment. And delight of cosmic being in the whole. It has taken up fully in the higher poise the true relation of the soul and nature. And at this point that journey is complete. So these last two sentences, which are quite intricate and complex, we will explore in detail next Friday, where he looks at what was that aspect or power of God working in the nature, and how that works, and what is the relationship of the soul with that, and the universalization in which the individual soul joins with and is a part of the cosmic being while still maintaining the poise of individuality for the purpose of the play. Yes, the term used is Virat, large or vast, infinite in scope. So we pause here. And you see how Sri Aurobindo brings us to a deeper unity of these two. And then the next paragraph he will show how these two are aspects of the Satchidananda, and therefore it is always the same oneness of Satchidananda that takes this double poise and for the purpose of the play appears to be this irreconcilable opposite position of soul and nature. But secretly behind it is always the same one, Satchidananda, experiencing the delight of this particular aspect of the play. We can close with this. And continue next Friday.